So today I'm gonna fix Adam Ragusea's Detroit style pizza recipe. Because as someone who grew up eating this style of pizza, watching his video, it's a bit frustrating. Now I do like Adam, I think he's a great cook and he's got a lot of solid recipes on his channel. But this one, well, let's just take a look. Adam Ragusea Detroit style pizza. Go.
Traditional Detroit-style pizza at home, modeled after Buddy's Pizza, the original Detroit pie.
So you can already see here, it doesn't really have the crispy edge that it should for a Detroit-style pizza. And I've already watched this video, so I know why that is, but we'll get into that in a minute.
You'll want to get a cup of water per 110 inches of pan area.
A cup of water per 110 inches of pan area. That's how we're gonna measure this. So that's my first problem. I mean, not the most intuitive way to measure this, but
a teaspoon and a half of dry yeast, a teaspoon and a half of salt, and I'm not gonna bother measuring.
Okay, hold on. So he said a teaspoon and a half of salt. And if we scroll down to the written recipe in the description, he says 1.5 teaspoons of coarse salt. If we're using Diamond Crystal Kosher salt, which is what I usually use, teaspoon and a half is 4.22 grams. But if we're using any other coarse salt, because there's a lot of different brands out there, we'll just try this one I have as an example. That's 9.3 grams. That's literally more than double. That's why you always go by weight when you're baking. And especially with salt, it makes a huge difference. The salt also has a huge impact on the structure of the dough, the way that it ferments, pretty much every part of the process. So it's a pretty big issue that he didn't actually mention which brand of salt he's using.
A teaspoon and a half of salt, and I'm not gonna bother measuring my bread flour at Buddy's.
He's not gonna bother measuring his bread flour, which I get it. I mean, he's trying to make it seem easy or effortless, whatever, but it's honestly easier just to measure it. Like, you need somewhere to start from.
Here's the original. It starts with a dough that's on the wet side.
It's probably somewhere between 60 and 70%.
Yeah, and looking at it, to me, it does look to be about 65% hydration. I would definitely say no higher than that.
Cover and let the particles hydrate, let the gluten autolyze for about 20 minutes, come back, dump in a little more flour, that was probably too much, flour your hands and you can more easily.
Just saying, you wouldn't have to do that if you had just measured the flour initially. I mean,
the original traditional Detroit-style pizza is made with Wisconsin brick cheese, which can be hard to find, so I had to order an absurdly large block on the internet. In effect, it's kind of halfway between low-moisture mozzarella and cheddar cheese.
Yeah, so that's right. I mean, Wisconsin brick cheese is the traditional cheese for a Detroit-style pizza. Trying to see, yeah, he didn't provide a link to the one that he bought. I mean, obviously you can just Google it. It would have been nice if he did that, but for me, I happen to notice that my local Gordon food service has it, so you might want to look in your area before you go and buy it online, but apparently that's what he had to do.
Sure, you could use a young cheddar instead, or low moisture mozzarella, or a mixture of the two instead.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. Like, you don't have to go and make a special trip just to buy this brick cheese. If you want the absolute 100% authentic result, yeah, that's what you want to use. But like you said, something like mozzarella or white cheddar or a blend of the two would work pretty well too.
Buddy's, like many classic American pizza places, uses canned tomato product from a company called Stanislaus that almost exclusively serves commercial operations. Hence this absolutely gigantic can I had to order off the internet. I don't know if Buddy's uses this particular product from Stanislaus, 7-Eleven ground tomatoes, but it's a favorite among New York pizza places and it legit tastes amazing.
Yeah, so that's definitely right. I did see on Buddy's website they use Stanislaus products, and I would bet they probably are using 7-Eleven. If you saw my New York style pizza sauce video, I compared a lot of these different tomatoes, and 7-Elevens are really good tasting tomatoes.
Whatever herbs and spices you like, I'm using oregano and thyme and a little garlic powder and some pepper. Buddy's sauce tastes like they use those similar things, but they go easy on the spices. It's a very plain sauce.
So again, we don't get any measurements here, which I guess is fine. I mean, some people don't want to bother with that. But again, if you're trying to replicate an authentic pizza, you should at least give people a place to start. I mean, a lot of people aren't really comfortable enough with making pizza or cooking in general to really measure spices by eye. So for my recipe, I'm going to give specific quantities. As far as the spice blend though, it does seem to be pretty good.
Dough has risen and now it's time to get my pan. What I've got is an 11 by 15 inch pre-seasoned blue steel Detroit style pizza pan that I bought online. It's pretty similar to the ones they use at Buddy's. I seasoned it.
Yeah, so this is another one of my bigger issues with this recipe, is that this is actually not a Detroit style pizza pan. You can tell the edges are quite a bit lower, and you might think that doesn't really make a difference. That's definitely what I thought at first. But as I watched this video again and tried to follow the recipe myself, I realized that it creates a couple pretty big issues. The first is that it's not in the standard size of a Detroit style pizza. Detroit style pizza pans come in either 8x10 or 10x14, whereas this one is 11x15, which is fine if you're just trying to make a good pizza. I mean, it doesn't really matter what size it is, but it just makes it a lot harder to follow this recipe. Because unless you're also using the wrong type of pan, you're never gonna be using these exact measurements that he has listed. You're always gonna have to convert using his funky 1 cup to 110 square inches, blah, blah, blah type conversion rate. I literally had to make a spreadsheet to even be able to follow this recipe. So if it's 237 divided by 110, that's 2.37 grams of water times my 80 square inch. Yeah, so that's, then he gave the yeast in a volume. How much? 1.5 teaspoons, which would be 3.1 per teaspoon. So, but I need to convert that to my pan size. Oh my god. But that's only problem number one with using the wrong type of pan. You can see his pizza pretty much goes all the way up above the top of the pan. You want the edges of the pizza to be down here so that the cheese can be up against that border and get that crisping and that charring. So again, I didn't think it'd be a big deal at first to use the wrong type of pan, but it really does make a difference. I mean, the pan is probably the most important part of a Detroit style pizza.
You could absolutely just use a big aluminum cake pan or a half sheet pan. Your crust might not get quite as brown, but it'll still be good.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's not to say that you have to go out and buy a Detroit style pizza pan, but if you're gonna be showing the recipe and showing that it's a relatively authentic version, you should be making that distinction. I don't know if he didn't know or if he just wasn't able to get the right type of pan. And again, it would just make the recipe a lot easier to follow if you're using the standard size pan.
The basic Buddy's pie has a layer of small pepperoni slices under the cheese. I could only get big slices, so I'm cutting them into quarters before I lay them on. Small pieces mean
So you're starting to top it. Personally, I would have let it proof for a little bit longer. It's almost impossible to overproof these things, and I think kind of the longer you let it go, at least up until a certain point, it's just gonna end up lighter and airier. As far as the pepperonis though, he's getting that right. They go directly on top of the dough, at least at Buddy's.
cheese layer goes on next, our cold, coarsely chopped brick cheese that will melt nice and slow in the oven. At Buddy's, they make an effort to let some cheese fall along the side where it can brown against the hot metal. Now the sauce goes.
I do like that he coarsely chopped the cheese as well, because with this Detroit style pizza, it does bake for quite a bit longer than a lot of other styles. And so if you grate the cheese, it might kind of melt too quickly and start to separate and get greasy.
My pizza took about 15 minutes. Basically, you have to pull it when the cheese is starting to break really bad, when the casein proteins tighten up and start squeezing out orange grease. I wish my crust was a little darker by now, but that's just how it is, baking at 550 Fahrenheit in a domestic oven instead of the 7 or 750 oven they use at Buddy's. At Buddy's, they would cut this into 8 rectangular pieces.
Yeah, I mean, you can really see kind of the lack of crispness on the edges there. If we overlay that with the Buddy's pie that I tried when I went to Detroit, you can see a pretty big difference.
Not as dark as I'd like it, but that edge is still awfully crispy, and we've got some decent golden brown on the bottom.
Let's see that bottom again. Yeah, I mean, there's almost no browning on the bottom of that. And that's another thing that frustrates me with this recipe, because he kept saying, well, that's just what you get for baking in a home oven. You're just never going to achieve the same results at home. If he would have just baked on a lower rack, he should have gotten a lot more browning on the bottom, because of course with most home ovens, the heat's going to be coming from the bottom. He could have also tried using a preheated pizza stone or a steel, and then placing the pan on top of that. I've done that before. It makes a pretty huge difference. So I just wish he would have tried a few more things before writing it off and just saying you can't do it at home. Obviously, if you watch that channel, I'm a firm believer that there's nothing we can't do at home.
If you can't go to Detroit, that is like 85% the authentic product, and it's a great way to make a lot of pizza for a large group at home. Much love to the Motor City.
I will say though, I mean, it looks like a good pizza. I mean, it's pretty hard to make a bad pizza in general. But like I keep saying, he's calling it an authentic Detroit style pizza. And I mean, even putting authenticity aside, it's just a really hard to follow recipe. Like I said, if I were just doing this for fun, I probably would have given up on it. So I think we can do better. But before we make these recipes, we need to talk about this video's sponsor, AG1. AG1 is more than just your average green powder. It's a science-driven formula of over 75 different vitamins, minerals, probiotics, and whole food sourced ingredients that aid your brain, gut, and immune system. So I've been taking 1 scoop of AG1 every single morning, and it gives me a noticeable boost of energy to start off my day. It contains rhodiola, magnesium, and B vitamins, which support sustained energy so I don't feel the peaks and dips that I used to. And probably my favorite thing about AG1 is that it's an all-in-one supplement, so I don't need to take a million different pills to get the nutrients that I need. All I have to do is shake a scoop of AG1 together along with some water, and I'll be getting a full spectrum of vitamins and minerals that I might otherwise miss in my diet. So in addition to supporting focus and energy, it supports gut health, stress and mood balance, immune health, and even promotes healthy aging. And personally, I just feel a lot better while taking it. Especially on these days where I end up eating a lot of pizza, AG1 makes me feel like I'm actually eating a healthy diet. And I don't know how they do it, but it doesn't taste like you would expect a greens powder to taste. Despite having no added sugar, it actually has a slight sweetness, almost fruity flavor to it that I personally really enjoy. And right now, you can head to the link in my description to get a free 1-year supply of AG Vitamin D3 plus K2 to support bone and heart health, plus 5 AG1 travel packs with your first purchase. So thanks again to AG1 for sponsoring this video, and thank you for your support. So in terms of the dough, both recipes are pretty similar. I'm using a 65% hydration for both, but the main difference is that I'm using all-purpose flour for mine rather than the bread flour that Adam used. Because when I tried his recipe before, I found that the dough turned out a bit too chewy, and I think that using a weaker flour should help with that. Now I'm also using 2% salt rather than the 1.2% that he used, and for both recipes I'm using 1.3% yeast. So after mixing the dough, I'll let it rest for about 20 minutes to relax, then knead it, and Adam just kneads his in the bowl for about a minute. For me, I like to knead a bit more thoroughly to make sure the gluten is properly developed, so I kneaded for about 3 minutes on my table. Now we'll let the dough rise until doubled in size, during which time we can make the sauce. Now Adam uses Stanislaus 711 tomatoes, which I do think was spot on, but since I didn't want to have to buy a giant can, I'm using these Bianco de Napolis. In my New York style sauce video, I found that these taste nearly identical to the 711s by the time they're blended. So for Adam's sauce, I'm just adding his sprinkle of oregano, thyme, garlic powder, and black pepper, followed by some olive oil and water. And something I actually didn't notice when I watched his video is that he didn't add any salt to his sauce. I don't know if that was a mistake or if he actually does it that way, but in my recipe, I'm gonna add 2.5 grams of salt for this half can of tomatoes. Then I'll add about 3/4 teaspoon of oregano, 1/4 teaspoon of thyme, an 1/8 teaspoon of garlic powder, and instead of the black pepper that Adam used, I'm gonna use an 1/8 teaspoon of red pepper flakes. Now I'm also not gonna add any olive oil or water to the sauce because I don't think that Buddy's does, but I am gonna cook my sauce. Not a lot, just at a light simmer for about 10 minutes. But to me, I just don't think Buddy's sauce has that uncooked tomato taste that you get on something like a New York style pizza. Now to prep our cheese, again we're using Wisconsin brick cheese, and I do think that Adam's method of chopping it into cubes makes a lot of sense. That's essentially what Buddy's does, and since the pizza will be baked for a relatively long time, it'll help to prevent the cheese from separating and becoming greasy before the pizza is done. But now back to our dough, and after about 90 minutes of rising, both dough balls have doubled so we can prepare our pans for proofing. So I'm brushing Adam's with extra virgin olive oil and mine with a neutral oil. Then I'll just plop the doughs in and stretch them to the edges of the pan. I also realized here that Adam probably didn't use quite enough oil in his pan, so I'm adding a bit more to my recipe. Now you'll also notice that my dough ball here is quite a bit smaller than Adam's, and that's intentional. Obviously my pan is a bit smaller, so that's part of it, but I also felt like his pizza was a little bit too thick for a Detroit style pizza. So for me, I'm gonna use less dough and then let it proof a little bit longer so that it'll rise to the proper thickness, and as a result, it should end up a lot lighter and airier. But anyways, next I covered up the dough and let it rise again for about 45 minutes, at which time I could stretch them the rest of the way to the edges of the pan. Now to make my dough as light and airy as possible, I'm gonna let mine rise for quite a bit longer. But for Adam's recipe, he went ahead and topped it and baked it at this point. I did think his needed a bit more time, so I let it rise for about 15 more minutes. But at that point, I topped it with the pepperoni, then cheese, then sauce, and threw it into my 550-degree oven for about 12 minutes. Alright, so my dough here is still proofing. Probably gonna let it go for at least another hour or so, but I wanted to give Adam's Pizza a try while it's still fresh. Now I tried using a Sicilian style pan here, but what I realized while this pizza was in the oven is that my pan is actually still taller than the one that he used. This one has 1.5 inch sides. I think his were just an inch. So I guess what I'm saying is I still got a pretty decent crispy cheese edge here, but if I were using the type of pan that he was, I don't think I would have. The edge still isn't as nice as it could be. I think mostly because he just didn't put a lot of cheese on it, which was the main thing that stuck out to me as I was building this pizza. So for my recipe, I'm definitely gonna use a bit more. All right, so let's just give this thing a try here. Yeah, so I mean, I pretty much stand by everything that I said while I was watching the video. Obviously, I did kind of unintentionally fix the crispiness issue, but aside from that, I mean, the dough is just a little bit too chewy. I think that using that all-purpose flour, mine's gonna end up a little bit better. But also, the ratios just kind of seem all off. Like, this one seems really kind of dense and bready, just because there was so much dough, and then so little cheese on top. And the sauce, too, as I suspected, it doesn't have a ton of flavor to it. I do think the spice blend is pretty good, and actually, this raw sauce might be the way to go. But again, with that lack of salt, you just don't get that strong tomato taste that you'd want from a good pizza sauce. Now, like I said, I kind of unintentionally fixed the crispiness issue by using a higher sided pan, but overall, this thing just needs a lot more cheese. I mean, I've never seen bare spots like this on a Detroit style pizza. And obviously, if I were using the same type of pan as Adam, I wouldn't have ended up with this much crispiness. The bottom on mine actually does look pretty solid. It might just be due to differences in my oven versus Adam's. But again, I think that he could have easily fixed that by tweaking his baking method a little bit. Overall though, I think the recipe that I designed should fix all of these issues, so I'm very curious to give it a try. About a full 2 hours after Adam's Pizza went into the oven, I finally felt like mine was at the right level of proofing. So I topped it the same way, pepperoni, then cheese, but significantly more cheese than Adam used. And I also made sure to stack it around the edges to create that crisp edge. Then I striped on the sauce and I baked it again at 550 Fahrenheit, but I pulled it out after just about 10 minutes. All right, now this is a Detroit style pizza. You can already see I got that crispy cheese edge all the way around the border. Maybe could have made the pizza a little bit thicker, but we won't know until we try. Yeah, now that's a good Detroit style pizza. It's crazy how big of a difference just seasoning the sauce makes. Honestly, that's one of the biggest things I've learned recently is that seasoning the sauce a little bit more aggressively than you might think you need to can lead to a much better tasting sauce. I mean, the dough is nice and tender. It doesn't have that same chewiness that Adam's dough did. For me, the dough to sauce to cheese ratio is pretty much spot on. I used quite a bit more cheese than Adam did, and depending on your preferences, you might even like more than this. One thing I would say is I probably could have baked it a little bit longer. Seems like not all the cheese is completely melted, and the dough is maybe just a little bit moister than I would want as well. I don't know exactly how I'm gonna do that without overcharring the edges, but I guess that's something I'll have to figure out. I do think that cooking the sauce just a little bit was the right move too. It's hard to say for sure whether all the improvement comes from the salt, but this seems to have the right flavor profile and the right color based on what I remember from Buddy's. As far as the red pepper flakes, it's hard to say for sure whether it's more authentic than the black pepper. I'm not exactly sure what Buddy's uses, but it does add a really nice flavor and kind of spiciness to it. Now honestly, I don't think that thickness is too far off. Like I said, it might be a little thin, but I'll adjust that in the final recipe that I'll leave linked below. So either way, I think it's safe to say we successfully recreated Buddy's. But if you watched my last video, you know that while Buddy's is the original Detroit style pizza, it's not necessarily the best. So this is really only the beginning. In my next video, I'm gonna start my journey to making the ultimate Detroit style pizza. Something better than anything you get at Buddy's or anywhere else for that matter. In the meantime though, I recommend you check out that last video. Either way, thanks a lot for watching and I'll talk to you in the next one.